I think almost everyone likes gifts. And I think most people really like surprises too. So a little bit over a decade ago, a number of Google engineers got an unexpected delivery sent to their office address. Yes. That box contained two things. An envelope, we'll get to that, and one of these cool USB-powered plasma globes you see right behind me. Once those folks opened the envelope that came with it, they found this really friendly card. It's just a friendly message thanking them for their contributions at work after their recent work anniversary. There is only one problem. While Google created many promotional items over the years, this plasma globe was not one of them. What was real, though, is that Kate, like all the other engineers that received one of these packages, was working on Google's hottest new product at the time that was in development, and that was Google Glass. Now, some of you might remember Google Glass. Those were wearable smart glasses that were announced publicly just a few months before this exercise. And what was also real is that Kate had, in fact, celebrated her 4-year anniversary at Google. It was even announced on LinkedIn, where many of her coworkers and acquaintances had offered their congratulations. So the good news is the plasma globes worked. They looked very pretty. And while they were not really from the fictional HR representative, they were actually prepared by Google's red team. And they contained another surprise. So once connected to a laptop or workstation, they would emulate a keyboard and rapidly send a sequence of keystrokes to execute a series of commands, download and run an implant, giving the team remote access whenever the device was in use. Now, most of you are probably familiar with these types of devices in the form of USB rubber duckies or teensy development boards. But back when this exercise was conducted, the awareness for this was much lower. Our red team, though, offense security, was well aware of the hype that was building around Google Glass. Spoiler, it didn't really last. But we were running an exercise to find out if an adversary interested in the intellectual property could gain access to design documents, author specifications, and potentially more on the project. And it turns out that they could, even though it did require a number of extra steps after that initial access to gain the actual material of interest. And some of that definitely left some traces that could be used to reconstruct the attack as well. So once they had achieved access to these docs, they even went one step further. They used the access and knowledge they had to send an urgent email to the hardware team to prepare a prototype for pickup at one of our office locations. And I'll be honest, at this point, we were clearly pushing our luck. We were literally walking into the lion's den with a very flimsy pretext, trying to get unreleased hardware. But then again, those of you in the audience who have done red teams before probably know that sometimes you think to yourself, I'll definitely get caught for this, and then nothing happens. So it was worth a try. So try we did. Fortunately, or unfortunately, for the red team, this was not one of these cases where nothing happened. And this is where the story came to an abrupt end. The engineer that was tasked with preparing that prototype became suspicious, rightfully so, and alerted the security team. And once the supposed pickup appointment happened, the red team wasn't greeted by somebody carrying that prototype, but by our physical security team with some questions. Fortunately, the matter was quickly explained and resolved. And the team filed a number of bugs of the TTPs being used from initial access to Kate's workstation, to gain persistence, and ultimately to access internal resources and everything else necessary to get to that point. As for the plasma globes, since there were no good solutions available at the time to prevent this from happening again reliably, we implemented our own solution in form of a Python-based daemon that we open sourced as UKIP, USB keystroke injection protection, in an effort to make this type of attack harder to pull off beyond Google, too. And as this short story to start off comes to an end, I would like to welcome you all on this talk on building and running an internal red team. So this is most likely the least technical talk that I've ever given at a conference. And at the same time, it's probably the one that I'm most excited to share with you. So thank you very much for taking the time to attend. And I hope you will all walk away with some insights and thoughts that help you and your teams. So let me get started by answering two questions. Who am I, and what will this talk cover? So the first question, I think you already know, because you had the materials. My name is Stefan Friedli. I run the red team at Google. I got into security at a very early age. Things just kept going from there. And 5 years ago, I joined Google. At that time, Google's red team already existed, as evident by the plasma globe story that happened longer ago. But it was considered a 20% project. Some of you might be familiar with these projects. Google's founders, Sergey and Larry, introduced this very early on. And the concept is essentially to allow engineers to spend 20% of their work week on any passion projects. So for example, Gmail started as a 20% project. And so did offensive security, though admittedly our scope and our staffing is slightly more modest. Then in 2019, offensive security transitioned from a 20% project to a full team, and I joined to help with that process and to grow the team and to ultimately hack stuff. If you are interested in how I got started in security, CodeBlue did a really nice interview that is posted on the Facebook page, so I won't bore you with that. But just to give you a little bit of insight what I do outside of work, I try to get a balance from security, so I spend time with my dog Terry. I like tinkering with 3D printers and woodworking, and sometimes I spend way too much time on video games. None of that will be covered in this presentation, but if you want to chat to me about any of those afterwards, please feel free to find me. I will be very excited. So what will we cover today? We'll talk a little bit about what a red team is and what it is not. This is not as much about a canonical definition per se, much more about understanding what red teams are good and efficient for, and in which cases other approaches might be more beneficial. Then we will look at one of the key elements of driving impact for a red team, telling stories to facilitate change. Next, we'll look at the main reason why internal red teams don't survive their first year. And that's all about working closely with other teams in their organization. And then before we head into Q&A, if we have time for that, I want to cover a topic that's very important to me personally, which is how you can make sure that once you build your team, you can make sure it is able to maintain and is able to keep doing great work. So let's start with what is a red team. The security community has historically rarely agreed on terminology. This talk is not going to change that, and that's not my goal. That said, I think it's important that we have a common understanding for this conversation. So here's the mission statement for my team at Google. Think and act like an attacker to improve Alphabet's ability to detect, respond to, and thwart real-world attackers. The most important part here is think, We want our team to look at everything they encounter from two perspectives, both within the exercises and outside. First, obviously, as a Google security engineer whose job is to improve our security postures and protect our users and employees. But second, to look at everything as a potential adversary that is looking for new attack vectors. And if you look how red teaming was originally defined in a military context, this makes sense. This is how the US Army defined red teaming, and it's much broader than the definition we apply in a security context. And that also makes sense. Red teaming can apply to all sorts of different areas easily. At Google alone, we have separate red teams from ours for physical security and for Android, for example, just to name two of them. Some organizations I've worked with apply red teaming approaches to their legal processes. The core of red teaming remains valid in all these situations. To apply an adversarial viewpoint to your focus area and to challenge assumptions. Maybe because the definition is so broad, there can be a risk to consider red teams as a solution to all problems, and they're really not. And let's go back to cybersecurity to understand why. These are some services that tend to get sort of mixed up with some overlap. All of these are valuable in their own right, and I'm confident that you're pretty familiar with most of the differences, but allow me to highlight one key difference here, which is the difference between as many and a particular. One of the unique features of a red team is that it, by design, is not aiming for broad coverage, but rather looks at the path of least resistance to achieve a very specific goal. And that it does that across technological and organizational boundaries. One of the common main goals for penetration tests is to find and exploit vulnerabilities. For a red team, finding vulnerabilities is merely a means to an end, not an expectation. So let's talk a little bit about these things that work out really well, and also some of the drawbacks of running these kind of exercises as an internal red team. Just a few moments ago, I said that red teams are not a great way of finding vulnerabilities. For me personally, finding new security issues is at best secondary. We have great security review teams, and our vulnerability rewards program, our bug bounty, is working with a lot of very talented researchers all over the world. So we don't have a shortage of people looking for new vulnerabilities either. To me, this is the most important thing. Improving detection and response capabilities. We are a sparring partner for our blue team, both in terms of detection and response. We have to assume that we will be attacked by real adversaries, that we are being attacked by real adversaries. And we have to accept that we do not have the control over when or how this will happen. An adversary might have access to an O-Day, and we need to assume, at the size of our organization, that insider threats are a really real thing too. The American boxer Mike Tyson famously said, "Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth." So rather than hoping that we can find and fix everything an adversary does, a red team can provide opportunities to test and practice blue team playbooks, identifying potential new signals and highlight visibility gaps. And it builds some level of routine, so when a real incident happens and requires a response, there is a level of confidence and velocity that comes from having practiced. Red teams are also great at illustrating tangible risks in a responsible way. This is great for creating awareness with stakeholders. As security professionals, all of us here have a lot of context to understand isolated security problems. We know that default credentials in an old PHP application that's still running somewhere can lead to remote code execution, that can lead to lateral movement. Bad. You get the idea. We cannot assume that everybody has this perspective. System owners are usually pretty focused on their specific assets, and leadership and executives don't necessarily care that much about vulnerabilities in a technical sense, but they care about the potential damages that they can cause. This can make it hard, for example, for security reviews or even penetration tests to get certain issues fixed and to get traction on them. Red teams do have an advantage here. They usually go through the whole attack chain the way an attacker actually would, chaining bugs, lateral movement together until they hit their goals. So it's very hard at the end of that chain to argue with the impact. And yes, while it's not a priority, along that attack chain, there are usually vulnerabilities to be found. Misconfigurations, process issues that can be addressed to make similar attacks harder in the future. While I said that this should not be the primary motivation for running an internal red team, it is still crucial that these issues are reported and followed up on, addressed with the respective teams. So yes, that all sounds pretty positive. So let's look at the flip side. Red teams are expensive. This will probably be different depending on your environment. But in my team, I expect all our exercises to run for multiple months. And they do tend to get more expensive over time, as security controls are getting tighter and some central aspects like lateral movements become harder and harder. And there is more bad news. There is no guarantee that an exercise will give you the outcomes that you expect. Again, an adversary will usually take the path of least resistance, not necessarily the path that you are most worried about hardening. So should a red team. We have started exercises with extensive vulnerability research on a specific product just to pivot, ending up exploiting third-party software in a seemingly unrelated area that gave us the right path to move forward. These findings are extremely useful because they're not intuitive, but they might not be what you set out to look for. And finally, I'm not sure what is happening, but I will keep on talking. This all centers around trust. Red teams work best when they are as realistic as possible. At some point, you might want to do things as a red team that are very dangerous or seem very dangerous. So you need to build a reputation for your team that illustrates that you are capable of doing dangerous things, daunting things, in a safe and responsible manner. We'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later on. So, how do you want to do this?
We're just checking.
Okay. That was excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, now that we have that fixed and we have a little bit of context, let's talk about the one thing that I actually wish we focused on much more early. In red teams, we play the role of an adversary with a specific goal. When we report on it, we tell the story of how this particular adversary reached that goal. We could just file the individual vulnerabilities and design flaws that led to that outcome, but this is a missed opportunity. In the early days, we focused much more on just documenting the technical paths. Once we added a attacker narrative section to our reports, we saw a dramatic increase in engagement and remediation efforts across the entire organization. Suddenly, things started moving almost by themselves. And if you think about that, maybe you want to try the HDMI. And if you think about that, that makes sense. When you tell a story, you create a shared experience with the reader from an attacker's viewpoint, which makes all the risks and threats that you're talking about so much more approachable, even for a non-technical audience. So major security improvements, like security keys, for example, have benefited greatly from that storytelling approach to gain traction and gain the resources for broad rollouts, both internally and for our users. And if you think back at the beginning of the session when I talked to you to that example of the plasma globe, maybe that starts to make sense. Let's see how long this lasts. This wasn't a new issue at the time. But what is more approachable, more understandable? An object that you can see, touch, and handle that comes with a story attached to it, or just a description of a risk. Storytelling changes how things are prioritized. So how do we tell stories as a red team? We need to think first about who we are simulating. Are we a nation state? Are we a group of hacktivists? Are we a disgruntled employee? And what goals do we pursue? Are we after money? Are we after causing damage just for retaliation? Is it corporate espionage that we're trying to simulate? Motivation really matters, and your decisions should be based on that. And so should your capabilities. A nation state will likely spend much more time on operational security than a group of hacktivists would. So as a red team, take that into account and try to simulate it accurately. And most importantly, when you tell the stories of these exercises, be authentic about the journey. Reality is rarely simple and straightforward, and neither are good stories for that matter. When you write a report, you shouldn't just focus on what worked. Share where you got stuck and what did not work just as much. Not only does it make for a better story, but it also shows the struggles of a real adversary and important areas that might have drawn your attention, even though it ended up being a dead end, that can provide really great opportunities for detection. All of this allows the reader to understand the simulated adversary and to find ways to improve systems to prevent their success in the future. So let's switch to collaboration. I had the privilege to meet many other red teams over the years. Many of them did really well. Some of them, not so much. Some of them lasted less than a year. Here is my theory why. They isolate themselves. Why is this bad? There's a number of reasons. You have a pretty exotic role as a red team. You're essentially a team of people paid to cosplay as the bad guys. While doing so, you will inevitably highlight shortcomings owned by other teams and the work they have done. If you're being overly secretive and guarded about your work, and your reports are perceived to assign blame, you will quickly be perceived as an actual threat rather than a simulated one. As a result, your work will be challenged, discredited, and potentially blocked by concerns about risk or the lack of constructive value. In contrast, when we look at partnership-centric red teams, when we go beyond just finding issues, but we switch our perspective and help teams to take the attacker's viewpoints. We get them on board to tackle challenges together. We are not assigning blame. Building things always comes with potential attack surface. What matters is to keep moving forward and to keep improving. And sometimes this also means that we need to advocate for affected teams. I've experienced leaders who would point fingers at their own teams for implementing minor security flaws. This is a real good opportunity for you to build trust with that team and helping leaders to understand the nature of information security better. And ultimately, if we can engage people enough through our work that they start thinking like an attacker about their own system and products, we gain a ton of opportunities. First of all, they will start pressure testing their own assumptions and their own ideas. But it can also be helpful for your own efforts in the future. At Google, we took this a lot further, and we regularly involve subject matter experts in Thanks for bearing with me. We took this a lot further. We involve folks as subject matter experts in exercises directly, which gives us a lot more context on the systems we are attacking, and also gives them a front row seat in the attack chain, which again helps them to share that knowledge with their own teams. So there's a number of critical partnerships, and we touched on most of these before, but let me quickly go through them. Detection and response, I cannot overstate this one enough. Much too often there is an explicit or implicit divide between red teams and blue teams. There is somehow this perception that they are supposed to be separate, even opposing each other in some way. And this is an anti-pattern that you should look out for. If there is one team that you should work with as closely as absolutely possible, it is your blue team. That requires trust. We share our full activity logs in real time with our blue team. So in case an incident is triggered by any of our exercises or real, they can quickly triage if it is in fact an exercise or a real threat. Would that technically allow them to cheat and catch all of our exercises? Yeah, theoretically. On the other side, we could easily gather information about signals and detections implemented and how to avoid them from the documentation we have access to. The key point is, our teams benefit from each other's work, so neither of our teams do cheat. But it's about trust. Security champions can be super useful in large organizations. Sometimes it can be difficult to find the right person to talk to in a specific area. Having a network of security champions and maintaining those relationships can be really, really helpful. A good way to do that is to meet quarterly, maybe even twice a year is enough, and just check in on what they are planned, what is on their roadmap, and if this aligns with things you might already have planned and how you can support them. In return, you have a point of contact and can help you to find the right contacts and to advocate for you if you have findings that need addressing. Threat intel teams are probably obvious for folks who have tried to do realistic exercises before. But if you do have a real threat intel team and you want to be realistic, you should absolutely talk to your threat intel team. They can give you very crucial feedback on how your scenario aligns with things that they observe in the real world. And they can help you execute authentic exercises, or at least be aware of the creative freedoms that you're taking. And last but not least, do not skip the lawyers. I repeat, do not skip the lawyers. This is another relationship that requires a bit of investment because you will likely need to explain what you're doing and why, and that might cause some concern and confusion in the beginning. But if you want to do things that are potentially having legal or compliance risks, having someone to advise you on those and sign off on those is absolutely crucial to unblock these efforts. And speaking of doing things safely, one of the first documents you should create are your rules of engagement, where you set ground rules for what you can do, what you cannot do, and the area in between that requires further discussion on a case-by-case basis. Here is why. If you want flexibility and freedom as a red team, you need to set guardrails up front and let your leadership know exactly what you're going to do and get them to be comfortable with that. At the same time, you also need to be clear about where the lines are that you're never going to cross. For example, at Google, we will never access actual user data. This is something we work around with own test accounts. That works pretty well for us, but that's one of these lines for us that we never cross. On the other hand, we have established firmly that we will always test live systems, since that is crucial for us to perform realistic attacks. And last but not least, we also set expectations about how we limit risks. I mentioned the activity logs before. This is a requirement we put on ourselves to document and timestamp every adversarial activity we take, so they can be clearly identified in case of an incident. That's a significant amount of work, but it gives us the full flexibility and freedom to do what we want to do in return. So with that, and time running out quickly, let's move to the final section, how to build a team and maintain it and keep it healthy. One of the most common questions I usually get at events like this one is, if I'm building a red team, what qualifications and what skills should I look for? And that is actually a really, really hard question. Why? Because it's easy to find one really good red teamer. But if you then look at this really good red teamer, and you keep looking for people with the same profile, with the same background, rinse and repeat, that might initially not be a problem, but over the long term, all your exercises will look the same because you're looking for the same skills. You need a diverse team if you want to simulate diverse adversaries with various capabilities. So ultimately, I would highly recommend to not focus as much on technical qualifications, certifications, and similar aspects. Instead, once your team is bootstrapped and running with 2 to 3 people, focus on previous experience, not necessarily in offensive security, areas of expertise, the ability to think like an attacker, curiosity and creativity, and start growing the red team specific skills internally. And once you have a team, it becomes your responsibility to make sure it can thrive in the long term. If you're doing your job well, you will start making your own life harder as a red team, as controls and detections tighten. A lot of people who are drawn to this type of work and to security in general are ambitious, and they will create pressure for themselves on top of any external expectations. Very talented engineers have burned out because of this, and it's very disheartening to see. So it's really important for a team to keep a clear perspective on what their mission actually is. Getting detected is not a failure. More detections and better controls means that security is improving, and that's a good thing and a good signal for your team. For my own team, we go as far as not to really care if we meet attacker goals anymore. It doesn't mean we don't do our best, and often we do succeed, but we focus on simulating an adversary accurately and see what happens. Does it get detected? Why? Can we still move on and get over it? If not, what is stopping us? All of this is valuable insight, and it's important to keep that perspective. Success does not need to be binary and tied to reaching one ultimate goal. Because ultimately, red teaming is hard. The number of people suffering from burnout is on the rise internationally, and after all we talked about, we can probably see why. Security engineers and red teamers are particularly at risk for this. If you're building or managing a team, it is your responsibility to address this, to make sure you have a culture where it's safe to not have all the answers, to ask questions and learn new things constantly. Often when we have new people join the team, there is an assumption that everyone else around them knows a lot more about all these systems that we're targeting. But the reality is, in our environment, in most of your environments, things are moving much too quickly to keep up with everything. So there will always be a learning curve in red teaming. And you should normalize that as a leader. Another thing that would really help is not to have people work on exercises nonstop. Simulating an adversary is a lot of mental load. We encourage people to work on tooling and research efforts between exercises that don't come with the same high pressure and timelines. And we've seen some really good feedback with that approach. And last but not least, do not encourage heroism. We have all seen this one person that goes above and beyond, pulling crazy hours and overtime just to get things across the finish line. We probably all were this person at some point in our careers. But in 9 out of 10 cases, it's not worth it. Most of us are not in the business of saving lives, and things are not that important that very moment. So the additional load and stress is usually not worth the long-term payout. Encourage people to take care of themselves so they can perform at their best in the long run. So let's conclude. Red teams are a great sparring partner for your blue team, and they also help to find vulnerabilities along the way and are a great way to build awareness with partners, stakeholders, and even customers. To build a great red team, focus on collaboration. Be clear about your mission, what you can and what you cannot do. And take an active role in making things better and more secure, rather than just pointing out the flaws. We also talked about building and maintaining a healthy team at the end. Find people from a variety of backgrounds and help them to manage their time and energy so they can do their best work in the long run. And last but not least, there is no free Google Plasma Globes. You have been warned. That's all I have for you today. I'm happy to take your questions with the time we have or outside. Thank you very much. ありがとうございました。